Hello, everybody. So, we are going to start a quick series of migration video lectures talking about the various European migrants to the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, I'm not a big person on dates, but you need to know this date. There's something called the first wave of European migrants from 1790 to 1892. And this first wave of European migrants to the United States was a very Western and Northern European migration. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about Irish, Germans, some French, some English. Okay. Uh, what you need to know at this time is the U.S. is a very rural agricultural society at the time. We're not very urban yet. Most folks are farmers, so we really are a stage two society ourselves when these migrants are coming over. Now, the first group we're going to talk about is the Irish. We're talking about 2.7 million Irish came over during this time. And some of the push factors that compelled the Irish to move to the United States. Many of you may know Ireland was essentially a colony of the English at that time. It was also a poor, rural, agricultural state or colony, and essentially a stage two country. And because Ireland was a stage two country at the time, they underwent this huge population boom, going from about 4.8 million in 1971 to 8.2 million in 1890. So we have a very poor agricultural society undergoing a huge population boom. And at the same time all of that is happening, the English own most of the land. About 80% of the land in Ireland was owned by the English. So most of the Irish are poor tenant farmers not owning any land. And because they were so poor, about 50% of the population consisted of only eating potatoes, right? That was the sole staple of their diet for about half of the Irish. And as I'm sure many of you may know, in 1845, a deadly fungus began destroying all of Ireland's potato crop, right, known as the potato famine. And if half the population is only eating potatoes and all the potatoes suffer this deadly fungus, you've got real trouble. So we're talking in the potato famine, nearly 1 million Irish died and 1 million Irish migrated. So this is this big push factor that compelled many of the Irish to move to the U.S. Now, when the Irish got to the U.S., where did they end up living? One interesting fact is the English did not want the Irish to move to the U.S. They preferred the Irish, if they're going to move to Canada. So what the English did was they made the boat fares to Canada much cheaper than to the U.S. So what many Irish ended up doing was they would take a boat to Canada, to the eastern coast of Canada, and they would actually just walk across the border from Canada into the U.S. And that's why when we talk about the geographic distribution of the Irish, they are really in New England, the northeast United States, down from Maine to Massachusetts, into Boston being the main urban center. So these folks are really geographically distributed in New England, the northeast United States, and they are really, really an urban population. Not many of the Irish will become farmers. Many of them are working and living in urban areas, especially Boston. So what type of work did the Irish do? I want you to think of the Irish as doing these menial, urban, nasty, hardworking, low-paying jobs that native-born Americans did not want to do. Building canals, building railways, building roads, building sewers. They worked as servants, the low-wage, low-skilled jobs that native-born Americans simply did not want to do. The Irish filled many of those types of jobs. They would later become policemen and firefighters in great numbers. We'll talk about that later. But the Irish, they work for less, they live for less than native-born Americans. They really were kind of at the bottom of the social hierarchy, kind of on par with the African-American population at the time. And the last question we'll talk about is how well were the Irish assimilated? How were they treated in the United States? And I think many of you may know the Irish were not treated well at all when they first arrived to the U.S. They were seen as kind of on par with blacks. They were not seen as white. They were seen as an alien, other race. Many people describe the Irish as Negroes turned inside out. Okay, an awful saying, but that's how many perceive the Irish to be. And why were the Irish perceived to be this sort of alien other race? The major strike they had against them was they were Catholic. There's a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States at the time. But also they were very poor, rural, uneducated, unskilled. And people saw the Irish, this uneducated, unskilled population, as somebody that's going to be relying on government service and not working hard and being a burden on the country. So a lot of anti-Irish sentiment, really perceived as racially other and alien race, definitely not white. Now, today, would you consider the Irish to be white? And looking out there, I can see most of you are nodding your heads, yes, the Irish are white. So there's this interesting book out called How the Irish Became White. And kind of the thesis of this book is what the Irish did was they embraced their whiteness by persecuting blacks, by joining other whites in their persecution of blacks. And how they did this was, what the Irish decided was, if we are seen as working alongside blacks in the jobs that we do, we are going to be perceived as being the same as blacks. So what the Irish began to do is, in the jobs that they did, working those urban jobs, later policemen and firefighters, they monopolized those jobs. They kept blacks from working in those jobs, and then just had it so they were separate from blacks, right? They kind of joined in on the oppression of blacks as a way of becoming white, right? They learned to collaborate with other whites in their oppression of blacks as a way to become white. And in doing so, what's ironic is this is a group of people that were incredibly oppressed in Ireland, and then they joined in on the oppression when they got to the United States against blacks. So it's kind of this sad tale in U.S. history, but that's kind of how the Irish became white, is they joined in on the oppression of the African American population. So that is the story of the Irish, and we will do the Germans next.